Talk about sex, baby. So today we're talking about sex. We're even going to be extra spicy and talk about the intersection of sex and magic, specifically about sex magic in traditional witchcraft. I'm LaureleiBlack, still your favorite witchy aunt, and this is Blade and Broom. If you're digging what we do here, click like and subscribe. And now let's just hop right into our discussion for today. Okay, so a couple of ground rules for this particular exploration. One, I'm not going to be giving explicit descriptions of sex. That's not what we're here for, at least not what I'm here for. Number two, I want to reiterate now and also throughout the video that enthusiastic ongoing consent is the prime mover in any partnered sex magic. And number three, that's all. Don't make me make more rules. Okay, so within my tradition, sex magic isn't specifically explored as a topic of study and practice until the final stage of formal training. So basically in preparation for third degree. It's not like it's a taboo or forbidden topic before that particular place in a person's training. It's just more that sex itself can be really complicated and nuanced. And there are a lot of theoretical and practical magical precepts that I feel a person ought to understand before mixing magic with sex. That being said, I feel like this topic doesn't get nearly enough coverage in modern witchcraft books, not even in the tradcraft ones, which is one of the reasons that I feel called to talk about it right now on the internet openly. Consider this video some of that behind the curtain insight that you know we get into around here. I'm telling all the witchy secrets. So what follows in this video is basically taken verbatim from my book, the Red Thread Academy Year 3 Mastery. It is the last book, the red book in the Red Thread Academy series. You can consider it a taste of the kind of high quality real magic lessons that I offer up within the RTA or the Red Thread Academy. You're welcome. And if you're in the RTA, this is a sneak peek of what lies ahead in your study. You're welcome. So let's start with a little bit of background. Many years ago, Sarah Ann Lawless wrote a really fantastic article on this very topic for her blog, The Witch of Forest Grove, which was eventually changed to an eponymous title, SarahAnnLawless.com. Later, after she had written that, so a few years later, she wrote some scathing and very important rebukes of a sexual predator in her regional craft community and the rape culture that enabled him to operate without censure. That was during the beginning of the Me Too movement, to kind of put that in a historical context or timeline, cultural context. And she found herself absolutely inundated with hateful messages from the witchosphere, calling for her to basically sit down and shut up. And after several months of battling what I'll call the malendanti, she pulled her personal blogs down and retreated to a more private space in order to restore and preserve her mental health. She still participates in the community, mostly via her shop, Bane Folk, but also, through presentations at conferences and that type of thing. But she cautions others against the pitfalls of sharing their personal witchery with the whole internet. And I absolutely do not fault her for taking this approach. I've had similar experiences, actually, which I'm open to discussing in safe space with folks who are wanting to have real dialogue about creating safe spaces. As a reader and fellow witch, though, I'm sad that her remarkable work is no longer available and accessible. I reference it all the time, literally all the time. And some of her work is actually accessible if you dig deep enough and wade through the captures of her sites that are stored at the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. She was a trailblazer, still is a trailblazer, and her article on sex magic and traditional witchcraft is the first and only treatment that I've really ever seen on the subject. If you can find a copy, read it. At the time that she wrote the article, I was already a fairly accomplished sex magician in the sense that I was organizing the Scarlet Track at the Babylon Rising Festival. I was a long-standing priestess of Aphrodite, and I was a student and teacher within the Kadishti movement. I attended workshops and rituals with Don Craig, who wrote the book, Modern Sex Magic. So literally wrote the book on modern sex magic, some of which he led, of those workshops and rituals, and some of which I led and that he was a participant in. And my high priestess had taught some witch-specific sex magic within the very first coven that I was in, the one where I was trained and initiated. But Sarah Ann Lawless's article was the very first one that I saw that specifically approached this area of magic and sorcery from the perspective of a folkloric traditional witch. There are a whole lot of resources in the world for information about sex magic and sacred sexuality in general. And if that's an area of interest for you, read all of those that you can with an eye toward what comes from those folkloric sources and what resonates with your sense of art. Some of the books that I personally recommend are Sex Witch by Sophie St. Thomas, The Art of Sexual Magic by Margot Anand, Modern Sex Magic by Donald Michael Craig, Sexual Sorcery by Jason Augustus Newcomb, and Sex Magic by Frater UD. And I have all of those linked down in the description, so feel free to pop over and add them to your library if this is something that is of interest to you. And of course, I'll reiterate that there's an opportunity for in-person discussions, workshops, and rituals related to sex magic and sacred sexuality at the aforementioned Babylon Rising Festival. The Scarlet Track still happens. I don't lead it quite like I used to, although maybe this year I do, who knows? But it still happens, it's still going strong, and there's lots of everything from just verbal dialogue to demonstrations to workshops where you get to sort of experiment within your boundaries, and then all the way into rituals, which again, you get to participate in within your boundaries. So in the meantime, before you've dug into the books and attended festivals, where this is a topic of interest and discussion and practice, I would like to share a few of my own thoughts on the subject. And my thoughts are kind of, I remember, because I don't have access to that wonderful article that Sarah had written, but what I recall being in there, also some of the things that are part of my own observation, my own experience, and my own study. All of these reasons and methods that I'm going to be talking about and considerations and warnings are all accessible for individuals who are working alone, for people who are working with a partner, and for people who are working within groups and want to try some sex magic in that particular idiom. All of these reasons, methods, cautions are offered without reference or alteration based on gender identity or sexual orientation. If you are a consenting adult, these are open to you. So let's talk about some reasons why you or anybody might want to engage in sex magic. The first one that I'm going to mention, these are kind of in no particular order, but the first one that I'll talk about is energy raising. Sexual energy is quick and really easy to raise, generally speaking. It makes for a great method of raising energy for the charging of talismans or like otherwise fueling your spell work. You might also engage in sex magic for healing purposes. Sex magic and sacred sexuality are a good tool to use for engaging in lots of different types of healing work, including healing around psychological wounds and sexual trauma. You might use them for energy offerings. Some spirits and deities prefer sexual energy to be given to them as a part of the regular offerings that we might make per our compact with them or our agreements, our deals with them. You generally know if this is the case with a spirit or deity that you're working with because they're going to show up in your dreams in a sexual nature. They're going to come into your fantasies when you're having some special alone time or when you're engaging in sex with a partner. Or you're just going to kind of get sexy vibes when you think of them, even if that's not how other people seem to think of them. So for those spirits and deities, offering your sexual energy may be what they want. We can also use sex magic for altering consciousness for spirit communication. So some spirits and deities communicate best with a witch when that witch is already in progress, engaged in a sexual activity. In those situations, you might see images, you might hear messages, or you might just like have a sense of knowing new insights and information. Sex magic is great for spirit bonding. So in the same way that we engage in sexual intimacy in order to deepen our bond with a human partner, or we can, those of us who are interested in sex can and do that, so too might we build deeper love and trust and bond and commitment with a spirit or a deity through spirit sex. And so potent is the ability to bond in that way that it is also a very effective way to sort of create your compact with a spirit or to seal the deal on that compact that you've made with them, on that agreement for a relationship that you've made for them. So blood is most commonly mentioned as the sort of seal for compacts. When any bodily fluid is mentioned at all, and sometimes they're not, but sexual fluids and menstrual blood are also both used very commonly in this regard, since they also carry the life force of the witch. And in this sense, I would almost think of it as the consummation of the relationship that you've just established with them. So in the same way that a bride and groom, or groom and groom, or bride and bride, spouses, spice, that's the plural, in the same way that spice when they're newly married celebrate that commitment with the sex act, so too can we do that with spirits. Another common practice within the magical world for like a reason for engaging in sex magic is generating the elixir of life. So this is a purpose unto itself, this generating of sexual fluids that sometimes even mixed with like menstrual blood. And these elixirs, or fluids, are used to anoint and consecrate magical tools. And sometimes they're also consumed, which I feel you. Like I can feel some of you that are not familiar with that concept going, what? But the way this is usually done is that it's usually mixed into wine or baked into a cake and then consumed by the person whose fluids they are. And that happens for a variety of purposes and reasons. So sometimes this is a Eucharistic act, like we experience within the Hoozle or the red meal. And sometimes it's done for another magical goal that's specific to the witch. Sometimes the cake or the wine are offered directly to the spirit as a libation and an offering. So there are lots of ways to incorporate that. Sex magic is also not an uncommon part of initiation. So the Hyros Gamos, or Great Rite in particular, is a pathway to initiation and initiatory experience within many branches of the craft. Yes, even tradcraft. This is not something that's specific to Wiccan covens, and like sort of British traditional Wicca type covens is where we hear about it the most, and it's a little bit fallen out of favor in the last couple of decades because of the abuses that can happen within the community and within a small spiritual community like that. So a lot of people shy away from that now, but it's wise to be aware that it is still present as sort of the initiatory vehicle, particularly at third degree. So our spirits and the deities that we work with might actually initiate or cause to begin a new stage of our magical development or experience using sex as a catalyst for that initiation. Along those same lines, another reason to engage in sex magic might be to transfer virtue within a craft tradition. So virtue is a term that's used within old craft, trad craft, to signify the power and authority of the highest office or offices within a coven or clan. So sometimes it's simply used to mean power. Virtue just can mean power in the sense of power that's raised in ritual. And when a new coven or clanad leader is installed in their office, some groups transfer this virtue from the outgoing leader to an intermediary vessel, and then from that vessel into the incoming leader. And the way that almost always goes is from the old magister of the coven, the outgoing magister of the coven, to the maid of the coven, and then from the maid to the new magister of the coven. So within my own tradition, we see our queens, devils, consorts, our third degrees, as being instilled with this virtue directly from one of our great powers at the time of the final initiation. Sex with another person isn't necessary and would really only be the preference in the case of committed partners. Another reason that a person might want to engage in sex magic has to do with something that I'm going to call the sacraments of ecstasy. So many practitioners view the pleasure of the sexual act as a sacrament unto itself. The orgasm is proof that the gods love us and want us to be happy. Okay, so I know Ben Franklin actually used that aphorism to talk about beer, but you get my meaning. Sex doesn't have to be a purpose, I should say. Sex doesn't have to have a purpose in order to be sacred. As long as the participants are engaging with consent, sex is sacred just by itself, and it is an act of magic. And the final reason that I'm going to explore here for why people might want to engage in sex magic has to do with gnosis. We're able to ride the wave of sexual ecstasy into a place of gnosis or enlightenment. We're able to have a higher, deeper, more complete understanding of ourselves, our partners, our gods, our spirits, the cosmos. That's powerful stuff. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why you might sex magic as a witch. Let's talk a little bit about some of the methods or ways. Again, we're not getting into explicitly graphic descriptions here. We're actually more talking about where the practical meets the magical for this. So there are several methods for engaging in sex magic. all of which actually have examples that are provided to us within folkloric sources if you go looking for them. So one of those methods is flight. We might fly out or cross the hedge or astral travel, whatever term that you use for that experience of being discorporeal, meaning not being in your body. So we might fly out in order to have discorporeal sex with a partner, with a spirit, with a deity. Similarly, we might have discorporeal sex in dream time or some other non-physical plane. Another method that we could use is a no-touch kind of method. So there are some waking time, partnered, and solo kinds of practices that can raise sexual energy and create a bond without actually physically touching. These include eye gazing and breath work and are likely to be part of what has been called fascination as an energy raising paradigm. The next method that we might use is actually masturbation. So moving into the more physical practices, the ones that we've talked about already have been more energetic practices. So moving into these physical practices, we can certainly engage in masturbatory sex magic. Again, this can happen alone, or it can happen in the presence of a partner or in the presence of a group and with sort of the commingling of those energies, even though everybody's just kind of doing their own thing. Non-penetrative touch is also a method that's used in sex magic. Partnered or group touching practices and rituals are far more intense than most people anticipate that they will be. So the touch doesn't have to involve the genitals in order to be extremely erotic, nor does it have to include the most overt of erogenous zones in order to be sexual and to raise sexual energy. So non-penetrative kinds of touching can be a great way for groups to engage in sex magic together without actually crossing relationship boundaries or violating oaths and vows that have been made to partners who are not also covenanters or involved in that ritual. And then finally, we come to penetrative sexual intercourse. Oral, vaginal, and anal intercourse between flesh and blood partners are probably the most obvious methods of engaging in sex magic. But I think it's really important for you to know that those kinds of sexual experiences, I can't say it now, penetrative sexual intercourse is not necessarily any better or more preferred than all of the others that we've just discussed. Indeed, at the risk of sounding like I'm actively trying to discourage penetrative sex, I would suggest that it can be a little bit more difficult to achieve the desired magical results when you add one or more actual human partners physically into the mix. In that scenario, everyone needs to share the same intent and the same consent throughout the experience. And because, again, sex is a complicated experience and has a lot of nuances, keeping everybody of a mind can be difficult. Not to mention that simultaneous climax is needed according to some philosophies of sex magic, and that can be challenging for some partners. And there's nothing bad or shameful or wrong about that. It's just if you're in the mindset of we have to have climax together at the same time in order for this magical result to be achieved, that's definitely putting a lot more pressure on everybody involved. Okay, so there are a couple of other notes that I feel like are worth making about sex magic, especially within traditional witchcraft, as you're considering all of these factors. So one of them, and this is just kind of under that topic of special considerations, there are whole schools of thought and practice that revolve around whether or not to orgasm as part of a sex magic working. People are very divided on this and have very different understandings of how it works and why it works. And I'm just going to say that I don't think that there's any right or wrong choice on this question, but everybody involved should be on the same page about it before you begin. Another special consideration is that toys are not necessarily forbidden in sex magic. In fact, there's a case to be made for the gandrid, or the riding pole of the witch, the broom, the staff, the stang, as being a type of sex magic toy. And again, I feel like that maybe deserves its whole own discussion as well. But that idea gives the riding of the broom several layers of double meanings and entendres to consider. And another consideration that I'd like for you to think about and consider for yourself where you stand on this has to do with consent. I said at the top, I'm saying again, consent is a primary consideration, a prime mover. Anytime that you're working with partnered sex, whether it's magical or not. So a partner absolutely needs to consent to the sex, but your own ethics and philosophies can kind of determine for you whether or not that partner also needs to be consenting to the magic part of it. I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. And honestly, it's a very ticklish topic. So that's another one that we might tackle in a whole other video if you're interested, is sort of the ethics around consent in magic. And sex magic is just sort of like a subtopic within that. So because this is such an intense, private, and intimate area of magical study, I really feel like there are some cautions that should be given. I think that it would be irresponsible and inappropriate not to talk about the things that you need to be on the lookout for and aware of within your magical practice if you're going to choose to include sex as part of that. The first one is, in my mind, predatory behavior. So predators exist in every part of our society at every stage of study and every stage of development. I'll even be generous enough to add that some folks don't recognize that they're engaging in predatory behavior. It's not a conscious decision on their part. But I will also, as generous as that is, I'm going to say that it doesn't excuse them. It doesn't excuse the predation that they've engaged in, just because they didn't know, or didn't understand that it was predatory. So we have to take care not to encourage or engage in that behavior ourselves, and not to give it space to thrive within our covens, our groups, our hearths, our circles, our clans, our community. If we see it, if we hear of it, we need to act swiftly to address issues of predatory behavior if you see them or if they get brought to your attention. Another little warning that I'm going to give is that there's a possibility for sort of preoccupation or a level of obsession around sex magic. I've witnessed it within the communities in which I operate. And I think that there are a lot of reasons for this. Good sex is fun and feels good physically, emotionally, energetically. Good sex is a good thing. good sex that produces powerful magical results can be mind-blowing. And that makes it a little bit addictive. So it can certainly lead to a sort of what we might call a sex magical awakening. And it can become really preoccupying within one's personal practice, or at least a preoccupying element within one's personal practice. And I'm not saying that it's going to, just that it can, right? It can have that potential. So I would caution covens and solo witches everywhere, not to necessarily have a prudish sensibility about sex or sex magic. That's not necessarily, like, I know within my own tradition, that's not a cultural sort of ideal, this sort of being prudish, that I would want to encourage. But as always, there's room for every individual to have their own thoughts and perspectives on the issue. And simultaneously, I wouldn't want covens within my tradition to kind of get the reputation of being a meat market where sexy witches are always looking for a sexy witchy time. And I give that warning because when I was first getting involved in the craft, way back in the 90s, this was a big topic of debate and concern because we were moving sort of away from the sex magic practices, the Great Rite and that type of thing that were included within British traditional Wicca, like Gardnerian, Alexandrian, and some of the abuses that had come with it. By the time that I was practicing, some of the early initiates were now high priestesses and high priests, and were training and leading people like me, and they were sharing about some of the abuses that they had experienced. Ritual sexual abuse is a thing. But it's not as common a thing as media wants to make it either. So there's that. I'll just kind of add that I think that in covens or groups, or for individuals where that sort of preoccupation or obsession with sex magic comes into play, it's also kind of pushing that dopamine button, pushing that oxytocin button. And that's part of what makes it so addictive. So it can be difficult to sort of break away from that, especially when it's going well. But because sex is complicated and nuanced, those dynamics can shift pretty quickly as well. So just be conscious, be present, be aware, be on the lookout. Another consideration is consent. Consent. We're going to talk about it all the time if we're talking about sex, if we're talking about sex magic. I cannot stress the need for consent strongly enough. If you're doing sex magic, always be conscious about consent. And finally, this is the very last consideration that I want to give you, is what should be, I think, a pretty obvious one, and it has to do with pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. So being a powerfully manifesting witch is not going to make your sperm, eggs, or any virus or bacteria comply with your will. Even if you have every reason to believe that it does, still show your wisdom, O witch, by using birth control with any partner where conception is a possible outcome, and use barrier methods of protection with any partner to whom you're not already fluid bonded. Big exception here is if you're doing sex magic in order to conceive a child, in which case, don't use the condoms. And done. Was it good for you? Post your thoughts in the comments below, ask questions. I would love to be able to sort of address any more specific questions that people have, or anything you want me to go into more depth on. Again, I don't feel like this is a topic that gets talked about nearly enough, but I also know that it is actually quite present within traditional witchcraft. More so on an individual basis, you know, a person engaging solo with their spirits or their deities. I hear about that a lot more than I hear about partnered or group sex magic practices, but they are there and I wanted you to know. And I'm rambling again. So if you found today's chat useful, encouraging, thought-provoking, inspiring, please bless me with the magic of the like button so that we can feed that algorithm. It's a spirit of its own, right? And tell your witchy friends that there's good stuff happening over here at Blade and Broom. I already mentioned I've got resources for you down in the description box, and that's going to include my witchcraft course if you are interested in learning more about that. And if you cannot wait until next week to dig into more witchy goodness with me, then check out the video that's coming up probably over here or over here, somewhere in this space. Bye, friends.